took a pretty good talk about drones before this. That was pretty awesome. But now I'm gonna slow it down a little bit with some blue team talk. Now, if you like this stuff already, it's something that pretty exciting stuff. Hopefully, maybe some people will learn a few things today. This is actually kind of like a part 2 of a talk. If you haven't seen part 1, you're probably not going to miss out though, because part 1 was really technical, and part 2 is more how to actually use this stuff. Who here does network security monitoring? Okay. Who here uses flow data on a daily basis? Okay, that's awesome. It's still like the percentage of people in here using flow data is like the largest of all audiences. Maybe not saying much though about the attendance right now, but that's okay. People are flooding in, says the guy in front of the camera. Can't see the doors. So, oh yeah, the PhreakNIC logo obviously is not the real PhreakNIC logo. It's a Twitter drama from yesterday. The other hip hop PhreakNIC was going on yesterday using the same hashtag, and Key had this like little Twitter fight with the guy using that. He's like, "You need to change your name." So that's kind of taken from them.
Is that from New York? Or?
It's Atlanta or New York or
Atlanta.
Yeah, whichever one they changed it from an F to a
Yeah, I was gonna
PH.
say the one that's in Atlanta was F.
Apparently it's been changed or something, so now it's like he's all kind of upset about it. It was funny.
There was something else in New York too, like about 8 months ago. That was also
That's right.
hashtag free.
Maybe the 20th anniversary of this one is time for us to change for some reason instead of them. So anyways, I'm Jason Smith. I've worked for a few government agencies, state, federal. I like to fry a lot of food. So I'm a big fan of the idea that if you take some hot oil and you throw some stuff in egg and flour, and you then throw that stuff in that hot oil, it'll probably be better than at the beginning. And you can pretty much do it with anything that's edible, and it's going to be better, minus like fruit maybe. But most everything else. I also like some IoT stuff, and I say IoT because it's a buzzword. I like little microcomputer stuff, Raspberry Pis, those Omegas, different things like that. Pretty fun stuff to mess around with, but I'm kind of one of those people that, like, I'll buy every single thing that comes out and I'll try it out, like this is going to be the thing I really use from now on. It's like really fun to mess with, and like 3 or 4 days later, I'm kind of bored and something else is coming out, so I have a big collection of stuff at home. It's collecting dust, and I give it out to kids and whatnot in schools. And on that topic, also co-authored Applied Network Security Monitoring with Chris Sanders. I always give this spiel here, kind of not so much for the book, but again to go, and remark on charitable contributions. So like all of our royalties, like we don't see any money from this. So I've never seen a penny from the book. It was just work to make it, and work to kind of market it. But instead, stuff goes to the Rural Technology Fund, Kiva. Hope for the Warriors, Autism Speaks, a few other things. And I always tell people, if you're buying stuff on Amazon, I always mentioned this morning, but go to smile.amazon.com instead of just amazon.com. Because you can set up a charity. It doesn't cost you anything to donate any money. And, a percentage of whatever you buy, Amazon matches that percentage and sends it to whatever charity you tell them. So, for instance, Rural Technology Fund is a nonprofit that Chris Sanders runs, and I try to help out with that. So I send all of my purchases there, and it really mounts up pretty fast because, over time, I think it was like yesterday, the day before, Amazon told me, hey, you've contributed 184 times to the Rural Technology Fund just from going to smile.amazon.com. So I recommend you do that. If it's not Rural Technology Fund, do it with whatever charity you like, because it's pretty awesome. So today, what we're going to talk about and what we're kind of not going to talk about. So we'll talk about flow data, a brief synopsis. What is flow data? Why is it important? Some basics. I already have people in here using flows and stuff like that. So I would kind of like to make this a little different than I normally do as well. that if you have like questions or like discussion topics or things like that, especially things that'll like help other people understand things that don't already, definitely bring it up, kind of as I go, at the end of a slide, beginning of another slide, something like that. But we're going to talk about the basics essentially, but more so how to actually get started with it, not like, really, really in depth on what is a flow and stuff like that. It will just be very slightly, maybe, 20% what one is and, 80% how to use them. So we'll go into how to collect all the stuff, all the tools that you need to use for that, and all free different methods, not any kind of pay for stuff. We'll talk about how to make friends with NetOps if you're not NetOps, or how to make friends with security, the security group if you are NetOps, via some situational awareness stuff. And again, I'm going to go through a bunch of different tools. I'm going to give some other shameless plugs for tools I've written, but hopefully they'll be helpful. And again, I guess at the end of this, I'd like to really show how valuable flow data is, because a lot of people say they want to collect it, and then maybe they do collect it, they collect sampled stuff or something like that. And I'm going to go into, try to detail why it's really important to do unsampled data, so you have complete control. So what is not on the agenda, really in-depth stuff about flows, because that's kind of boring, puts people to sleep. If you haven't already eaten, you'll probably like walk out to go to KFC over there. Stuff like that if I talk about really in-depth stuff, because it gets kind of in the weeds. I won't talk about other types of flows outside of just some common things, because the real flow names aren't going to really matter here, because when it comes to like version 5 or version 9 or things like that, we're going to talk about like 5 tuple stuff, so like kind of basic stuff. We'll talk about some collection methods, but not like generic stuff. I'll give you a picture basically, that's it. And silk methods we'll talk about, but not a ton of them. If you want to see all that stuff, you can go to that link, and you can see a lot of different really, really in-depth stuff about flows. So what is a flow record? It's easier to talk about PCAPs because everyone understands PCAPs. PCAPs are the full recording of all your network traffic, based on whatever filter you tell it to do. If you compare that to recording like a phone call or like 10 phone calls or 100,000 phone calls, it gets kind of difficult to actually parse through the PCAP. And so in that regard, we have a lot of different data types. We have, Bro provides a lot of metadata for, different protocols, and then flows and stuff provide kind of a summary of communications. And that's exactly what flows are. Just like you used to have this phone record of all your cell phone calls and things like that. They talked about, where did you, what is your number, where did you talk, how long did you, talk to these people for, things like that. Similarly, flows do that for like packets and whatnot. They're like a summary of all packets that came across the network, binned up by certain measurements, which I'll talk about a little bit. The other comparison of PCAP versus flow data, people say, oh, you gotta have PCAP, but in reality, most big organizations don't have PCAP at all. If they do, they have it for, like a day, which is actually pretty good for a large organization. It at least allows for some sort of daily instant response that you can go back and look at something. But, don't expect to, kind of go back a ton of time. The average amount of time that a threat actor sets in an organization after compromise is like 146 days, as of like the most recent 2016 trends. But if you have flow data, at least you can go back and have some record of at least where they came from, who they talked to, things like that. But PCAP, you're not going to have 146 days of PCAP. It's extremely unlikely. To compare, flow data takes up between 0.01%, 0.02% of the amount of storage of PCAP, and a good comparison to that, mountain versus molehill. And specifically, if the mountain's Mount Everest, I would be like the molehill, like if you want to get like a physical size comparison. And so it's, flow data takes up no space compared to PCAP. So another comparison, it'd be like this little Caterham compared to a big Velaz dump truck, PCAP truck, carrying a lot of PCAP. So that little K-drum, by the way, this little death trap I built, it's finally running and still overheating. But, the comparison is the same, but if you were to have like 6 of those trucks. So, give yourself a visual comparison of the speed and everything of that little car compared to that truck carrying 5 other of the same. And you'll get an idea of what it would be like, the speed of parsing PCAP, or parsing flows versus parsing PCAP. Obviously, they're not one-to-one comparison, but you get the idea. So flow data, the brief, what is it? It's called session data or net flow data, which is Cisco's term that they own. Some people just call them flows. You can call them whatever you want to, really. Again, they're just a summary of communications. They're not the packets themselves. This isn't like you're taking Wireshark and just cutting out the actual packets and looking at just like the certain aspects of those. It's a collection of packets all wrapped up based on certain things. Specifically, it's based on the 5-tuple. If the 5-tuple changes, then you may get a new record. The 5-tuple is your source IP, your dest IP, your source port, dest port protocol. When any one of those changes, you'll get a new record, and they'll keep stacking up packets in that record until a certain condition is met. There's a timeout where it's been happening for X amount of time, or it's a timeout where it's stopped happening for X amount of time. So you can imagine, it's like a factory worker each thing is coming in based on this 5-tuple, and it's like, oh, if these ever change, let me get another bucket and start packing things in that bucket as well, and keep getting new buckets, but after a time limit passes, throw one of those buckets out, or 2 of those buckets, or whatnot. You also have a start time and end time. There's calculations like durations, which are obviously differences between those times. There are a lot of fields depending on your version of flows. But again, I'm not going to talk about those because those aren't really important today. Again, essentially, we have the who, when, and where with flows, which is quite a bit of information in incident response. You have to determine the what really, and definitely the why. So again, how are our flows actually managed? I mentioned this termination condition, be it like, you couldn't just keep stacking on all this data inside of one of these flow records, because then it wouldn't be very useful. You may be able to bin up 24 hours if you set a termination condition on it, but then it'd be like one flow record for 24 hours for any given thing, and that would be very useful. You can run stats for that. Again, I mentioned the factory worker. He puts things in little buckets or baskets. It's a funny picture of Buffalo Bill, big fan of Silence of the Lambs. I would use his voice there, but it sounds kind of creepy. Wife hates it when I talk like him. So how do you actually generate and collect all this stuff? Any questions so far first? Okay, so how do we collect it? Again, so we have a few more people in here who uses flows in their environment already. Okay, so a decent percentage. If you don't mind me asking, what flow solutions do you use?
My largest is BBC flow.
Okay. Does anyone use any sort of open source flow solution in their environment?
We've got 2 solutions. We've got one, we're a university, and one of our alumni developed a product we're using theirs.
Okay.
It's observable networks. And then we also use, I'm not sure it's exactly broken, but we use Bro.
Okay, so the con logs and whatnot?
Yeah.
Okay, I always call it Bro Faux Flow because that sounds good to say off the tongue, but yeah, Bro is pretty awesome, especially if you like bi-directional flows and whatnot, and then you get a lot of additional aspects with Bro. It's fully analyzing things. My only problem with, I'll just talk about my only problem with Bro here in a minute, but I don't want to spoil it. It's not really a problem with Bro. It's a problem with just raw logs. But so generating flow data. So in this case, we're talking about like flows in their most literal sense, like so NetFlow version 5 or version 9 or IPFix or things like that, or SFlow or JFlow or NetStream or all these other things. And basically, you'll need some sort of sensor or some sort of router that can generate the stuff and be able to forward it or send it somewhere. If you don't have that, you need to get that first. A lot of times I recommend people, if you're already like you already have some sort of mirror or something like that set up at your organization for like alerting and things like that, then go ahead and just set up a flow solution there. It's fine. They take up very few resources, and why not, right? It'll be a very useful data type, require very little storage and very little hardware. You'll also need to know exactly what type of flows you're generating. A lot of these tools like YAF and FPro, they generate either NetFlow or IPFix, but all that stuff is received by SIM solutions and whatnot, and Silk, which I'll talk about today. So the flows themselves, there are multiple tools to use. I mean, especially if everyone listed their tool today that they're using for flows, it would probably be everyone's probably using something different, because there's actually quite a few. A lot of people historically used NFDump. NFDump was pretty well marketed as far as when they were pushing these things out. They came out with NFSyn, which is a visualization for NFDump. That was a thing that a lot of people used for a while. Around 2003-ish or whatever, Silk and Argus kind of came into the public domain, and those are used on some of the largest networks in the world. So when you look at like federal government networks, things like that, of course, the federal government uses Grow a lot, but for flow solutions in general, they'll use Silk and Argus and stuff like that. The government kind of told Carnegie Mellon a while back. Carnegie Mellon said to the government, "Hey, we can build you this cool thing if you'll give us some money." And they did a really good job to the point that they're still maintaining all that stuff, and they do a really awesome job of adding stuff to Silk, and Carter Bullard does a good job of maintaining Argus. There's also different solutions you could use, which I bet you probably use for Grow, is that either like an Elk Stack or Splunk or some sort of tool to parse raw solution logs. And when I say raw logs and log aggregation solutions, a lot of people, even if it is actual flow data, they'll convert that to some other thing that Elasticsearch can ingest, some parser that Elasticsearch has, or something Splunk can take it in. QRadar, a few other SIM solutions have separate flow solutions built in, so as not to mess up with their EPS. But there are a lot of tools that'll just take in generic logs. But there are some issues with that depending on hardware. And historically, things like Silk, there are people that are doing like 12 billion unidirectional flows a day on organizations, and minimal hardware can do that. So comparing raw solutions versus log solutions, I mentioned hardware. On a hardware level, the big issue is that if you don't have the ability to actually ingest the data, you're going to possibly drop the data. And at the rate of flows coming in, you really need to be able to just take in small bits of data really, really quickly. And sometimes that's kind of hard to do if the logs themselves are just raw text logs. Whereas a flow solution, like an actual solution like Silk or something like that, they are entirely intended on taking in one data type and one data type only, without having to do post-processing and things like that. And so in the end, your retention, your speed, the ease of use, because it's one flow or it's one data type, all that's really easy to do. On the flip side, if you already have a log solution that's already really, really robust and it's processing a ton of stuff already and is overbuilt so that you can take on any amount of logs, maybe it makes sense to put flows into that solution. I never really recommend it to most people, just because in the end it's like they may have a good time already with their Elasticsearch setup or something like that, and then next thing you know, they have to have a guy or gal constantly maintaining this Elasticsearch cluster because it keeps on messing up. Because it's when flows come in that your total amount of logs dramatically increase. So that's why I usually recommend raw solutions. The cons of a raw solution, it's flows only. You're not going to be bringing in other data types in most cases. They're not easily extendable, whereas you have like Kibana and you have Splunk. Those things are like clay. You can mold them to do whatever you want to. visualizations can be made, stuff like that. You can't really do that with a lot of flow solutions. Again, I mentioned NFSyn, which is the visualization brother to NFDump. It can do a lot of visualizations and things like that. But again, that's one of many. And so not all solutions are equal either in flows, because it's not just one version. I mentioned NetFlow version 5, it's the most common. I mentioned version 9. I don't mention 6, 7, or 8 or anything before 5, and that's because these versionings historically kept on moving around, even to the point that some were not even actually released. But most people use version 5 now. It's the simplest version. Version 9 adds a ton of fields. It's like 120 or something ridiculous. And then IPFix adds even more fields. And so things get kind of messy if you're actually dealing with all those fields. Today we're not going to talk about those things, and in most cases you won't actually mess with those things. Another issue is storage when it comes to raw solutions versus log aggregation solutions. Here you have a comparison of Silk versus Elasticsearch on the same data, and this was generated via a few different tutorials on the best ways to get NetFlow version 5 into Elasticsearch compared to the accepted ways of getting it in Silk. The little bitty slice there is Silk versus the rest is Elasticsearch. The data itself, you're going to use 28 times more storage to store the same stuff in Elasticsearch, and that's a comparison where they're both compressed. And in this case, it's 4 million unique flows that I generated. And in the end, again, 28 times more storage means 28 times less retention on the same hardware. So consider that. A lot of organizations that I've worked with, in fact, all of them, have stored flow data indefinitely with Silk, just because Silk is also not a thing where it's hard to add more storage. Silk is done in a way that you just have folders that are based on dates. And so when you tell Silk to look at a certain date, it's literally just looking at a folder. So you could have a folder that says year 3000 and tell Silk to look at the year 3000. It'll find whatever you tell it is in the year 3000. But it's that easy to add additional storage. It's just when you have more storage, then suddenly you can just fill that with more Silk data. Whereas it's not quite as easy with a lot of log aggregation solutions because they do a lot of indexing and things like that, and suddenly you kind of mess things up when you are changing the storage platform. Any questions so far?
Do you think, is it because Elasticsearch doesn't really understand the mass flows and does deduplication based on the super flows?
Yeah, so, and that comparison actually was without deduplication in either one. In the end, so like Silk can deduplicate, but with other tools and whatnot, it's like RW dedupe or something. But in the end, it comes down to one is a specialized binary format that Silk says, hey, I'm going to compress this, I'm going to make this as small as possible, and I'm going to store this in a way that I can still query it in a way that doesn't seem like you're not going to feel the compression, you know what I mean? Unless you do like multiple months at a time. I always tell people don't do more than a week on almost any environment. The difference is that Elasticsearch, on the other hand, is saying, hey, take all this stuff, convert this into some sort of raw format, just like a text format, parse that the way you need to parse it, and store it the way you need to store it. But it still compresses it, it just takes a lot more space.
And a lot of those tools like Splunk, too, they're building a lot of index data around it.
Right.
So you actually can end up with a negative compression.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you have all that performance searching it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right, and that's where you come into like a lot of maintenance. So like when people are maintaining Elasticsearch or Splunk or something like that, and you start running into these issues like, I should never have this much data, what is happening? Then it's like, oh, I have to go look at configurations and maybe change how things are being indexed and do all these other things. To the point eventually you kind of run into a problem where things are pretty slow. In this case, I tried to do my best to compare speeds and to do, I gave it a lot more hardware than I probably should. And in the end, despite Silk having, blazing fast search, Elasticsearch is also really, really, really fast when everything is indexed properly and whatnot. And as long as you have tons of hardware, you may be fine. Storage is pretty cheap, so if 28 times the storage doesn't sound like a bad thing, then yeah, it's great. And it also goes to say that if you already have all those other logs, then sometimes it's even better to use a generic log solution, because then things like that can be pivoted from, and you're not going to two different environments. A big pro of generic log solutions is that it's a one-all thing for you, and you don't have to have analysts going to Silk and then going to ELSA and then going to something else. They can just kind of go to one thing. So that's a benefit of log solutions, but again, you have the performance stuff that's an issue. So how do we actually get started and use flows? I'm going to talk about Silk and Flowbat. So Silk, that was a Carnegie Mellon tool. It was built largely with a lot of government funding. It's in use in a lot of places, a lot of states, a lot of federal agencies, a lot of different companies, very, very, very large organizations. It doesn't have any trouble handling that kind of stuff. But then I'm also going to talk about Flowbat. So Flowbat is a front end for Silk, not anything else. But what Flowbat does is it simplifies all the time management. It allows for some pivoting and whatnot, that you can pivot from one solution to another. You can do things like field interpretation, so that you're not seeing a 6, but instead you're seeing TCP in a field. You can do PCAP conversions on the fly, instead of having to run multiple commands to convert a PCAP to look at flows there. And overall, it's a learning tool for analysts to really get used to Silk as well, because we also show the end output that is a Silk query being reinterpreted. But if you run that query, you'll get data in Silk as well. Getting started is pretty fast versus a lot of generic log solutions. Silk on a box is a little thing I wrote to kind of 7 minutes or so, you'll have your full flow solution. And then you can install Flowbat on top of that. So it's like full flow solution times 2, I guess. And in total, you're like 13 to 15 minutes, depending on your network speed. I'm going to talk about kind of how those install here in just a minute. So what is Silk? It's the system for internet level knowledge. It is, again, that's a team with CERT. It's two different suites. Packing suite, which is accepting flows that are forwarded to it. It smashes them down, puts them wherever it needs to go, compresses them, does whatever it needs to do, whatever you tell it to do. There's a lot of different tools in the packing suite, but you may not use more than 1 or 2. But they allow for any number of tools to do what you need to do. I've never really ran into a problem that they didn't have a solution to. The analysis suite, the second set. The analysis suite does all of the analysis work that you'll actually interact with on a day-to-day basis. It does the filtering, the display, the sorting, etc. It does basically whatever you need to do. Whatever you can't get it to do, then you can just pipe the output to whatever bash tool you want to use. And I'll talk about some tools that are also available to do additional parsing. On the end here, I mentioned the documentation. Argus is getting a little bit better on its documentation, but I still say that Silk is probably one of the best documented tools that I can think of. They have analyst handbooks, they have all kinds of stuff, and on top of that, every single tool that's in the packages is really, really detailed in their man pages. So a simple diagram of what does it look like to actually collect flow data, specifically with Silk. You have these sensors, be it their IPFix or their NetFlow version, whatever, or you have some router that's sending hopefully unsampled flow data to this RW flow pack box. RW flow pack is like the muscle of the packing suite. It'll be ran on your security server. It'll take all those flows, and based on some configurations, it'll sort them the way it needs to sort them, and it'll put them in little folders, and it'll do what it needs to do, so that then your actual analysis tools can just look at those folders and say, hey, here's some flow data, I'm going to parse it, look at it, do whatever you want to do. Or the analysts may either SSH to that box, or what I recommend is that you install Flowbat on the security server, so then the analyst can just kind of go straight to that via browser. I keep mentioning unsampled versus sampled flow data. I didn't mention it much, but I really push this topic because a lot of people will say we have flows, but in the end, it's their NetOps group or something is like, saying, hey, yeah, we can afford to turn on flow generation, but a lot of these devices will only handle sampled flow generation. And that's the reason being is that if you're taking like 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 packets or something like that, you're more doing that for some sort of situational awareness on a performance, like a network performance level, and it's not at all for like instant response. Unsampled stuff means you have 1-to-1, so every packet that comes in is being stored or counted via the flow solution. And so naturally, you always want unsampled flows if you can get them, because I can't give you a lot of good examples of where sampled flows will work out for you in a security sense. If anybody else can, it'd be good. I could have an example, but they aren't very useful. So how to get started with flows, again, a quick summary. Just have some sort of hardware or software generating this stuff. Usually it's software for a lot of security operations centers, because they'll have like a box running Snore, they'll have a box running Bro or whatever. And what does that mean? That means they probably have a mirror or something set up somewhere, and it's mirroring all this traffic. Well, why don't we go ahead and generate flows on that? We can just install YAF or whatever on this box that's listening, and suddenly we have all the flow data. You'll need a Silk server to send all those flows to. Maybe you'll run FlowBat or whatever on that, and then you'll have the analyst, analyst person actually querying all that stuff, either going to the Silk box directly or seeing the stuff through FlowBat. There is a sensors.conf and a silk.conf file for kind of advanced setups, but a lot of people, if you have one sensor, that's not needed. If you have multiple sensors, you can just look at those two files and copy what they have for each additional sensor, so that everything is still stateful about where it came from. Because if you don't do that, you can get things mixed up. It's much better to say, let's have multiple different sensors. So how do you install Silk? Any questions so far? So that kind of depends. So again, the packing suite that's with Silk, there are all different kinds of methods. So a lot of times people will say, well, the issue I bet you're talking about is this encrypted method, right? So
Encrypted is an FTP, is HTTP, is its own thing.
So it's its own thing. But a lot of people will wrap that up in something like S-Tunnel or whatever, especially if you already have other things that are going through S-Tunnel from like, because a lot of times remote locations, if you have like a remote sensor, you'll have more than just that data. So you may be sending Bro data and a lot of other things, and you can SCP that over, you can do whatever, but a lot of people will set up like S-Tunnel or some sort of tunnel to just throw that over, just so that they're not worried about it at all. Everything's encrypted, there's no question about it. But by default, it's kind of its own thing. You know, YAF has, I forget what protocol it's actually using, but YAF has its own thing where it's sending IP things over. Okay. So Silk, how do we install Silk? There's a lot of painful ways to install it. Not very painful, because again, the documentation's okay. But the way I always do it in VMs and stuff like that is I use this little Silk on a box script. I assure you it's not installing anything malicious. If you just trust it, you'll be fine. Trust the script. So it takes care of all the dependencies. There's a CentOS installer as well that may or may not be updated as much as the Ubuntu installer, but if it's not, tell me and I'll fix it. If you have a non-typical network, again, you'll need to change silk.com and sensors.com. If you have epilepsy, then look away. Seriously, this is like very jittery. Okay, this is a Silk install. So like, I just kind of run this guy. You kind of do whatever you need to do, because again, it's like 7 minutes. Look into like how to do FlowBat. In this case, I go with the male. Like play with the cat a little bit. Cat's name's Cheeto. It's a Bengal cat. It looks like a Cheetos cat. It's more like a dog. Well, we're done. Enough talk about Cheeto. That was like 5 or 6 minutes, and that was a clean Ubuntu box with nothing done to it previously, and so it's installed. If you see all the green stuff, you know you've done something okay. How do you do analysis with Silk? So this is RW filter. It's like the thing you'll use more than anything if you're not using other tools like FlowBat. RW filter is a means of taking all of your flow records and it says, let me look into some specific folder or some specific bin, and let me pull out just a few things. I want to filter from everything down to something. Again, I mentioned do like a week or less, because if you start grabbing all kinds of data, I'll question the usefulness of what you're grabbing in the first place, because like there's only so much you can do with huge amounts of data unless you're running stats on them or something like that. Well, here's an idea of like, and I have these all in different lines just so it's easier to read. But records to and from some sort of Chinese IP address, going by country code here, over a specific week to this local CIDR range. And what you have is I say I want every bit of data. The type equals all means I want inbound, outbound, any sort of web stuff. I want everything. There's a list of types. I want to start date of 8/01/2015. I want to end date of 8/07/2015. Where source or dest is China, and where source or dest is some sort of local range. And then I want to pass that to standard out. RW cut then is pretty important because otherwise it'll yell at you if you just hit enter there. It'll say, hey, you can't read binary, so I'm not going to give it to you. And so instead it says, RW cut will convert that stuff to human readable form. And we're going to only do the fields, basically just the 5 tuple there, plus the source time. Start time. No questions about the RW filter. There's silk analysis with PCAPs. So this is how you typically convert a PCAP to flow records for silk to look at. I call them RWF files. You can call them whatever you want to, really. But basically, you'll take a PCAP of some kind. In this case, it's some sort of like SD bot infected device that generates this PCAP. And then you'll convert it with that RWP to YAF to silk tool. It's a terrible name for a tool. And it'll make this RWF file that then you can, again, use RW filter and then RW cut on to see what's happening. And there's an example of what that might look like. And again, you can use other batch tools to change that output however you need. There are options to change delimiters, do whatever you need to do, especially if you're going to later on script this stuff to be like, make a list of bad guys from, malware domain list and then churn it through this stuff once an hour. That's something you could easily script out with Silk, doing the same kind of thing. So stats, I mentioned statistical data, and that, you may use long ranges for stats. It's just this tool called RW stats. And I always recommend people try to say in a sentence what they actually want, and then try to type it out in how Silk wants it. So in this case, we want the top, --top, we want the top 10, we want the top 10 protocols, we want the top 10 protocols by bytes. And so if you can say what you want in a sentence, you could probably make it happen in Silk with RW stats. Then, an example of that, here's bytes transferred by protocol, as I just mentioned. And then you may have things like show the valid conversations, the top 10 SIP-DIP pairs for valid conversations. In which case, I did kind of a simple, non-fail-proof method of doing that by using this packets equals forward to anything, basically assuming that there's at least some sort of TCP or some sort of three-way handshake of some kind. And then we did, again, stats, top 10 SIP-DIP pairs by bytes. And you can do bytes, records, or packets as the value there. Last but not least, here are what different outputs look like. So RW cut is the human readable form of the actual flows in the raw form. That's not the only fields you could have. There are a ton of different fields. You could have all of them. They're going to look like garbage on your monitor. They won't be all that human readable at that point. But maybe you're processing them through something else. Maybe you're telling Elasticsearch to take some of this stuff, which is then very convoluted in our discussion here. But, it's possible, especially if you're making tools in Silk and maybe your outputs are pretty small and you're telling Elasticsearch only look at these special outputs because that may be what junior analysts need to look at, and then they can take that and then go to Silk to look at everything. RW stats will look like that, where in that case I've done this application filter. YAF does this a little deeper dive on actual applications to see if they are what they say they are. And if they're not, there are some plugins that will say, hey, these applications don't match with the ports that they're running on. Then there's RW count, which is just binning up all the data for a specific filter. So if you say, I want all data, and now let me run it through RW count with a bin size of 60 seconds. Well, in this case, it's 30 seconds. It says, oh, well, there are just 2.27 records in that 30-second span, 1380.27 bytes, et cetera, et cetera. The reason they're kind of split up is because you're telling it 30 seconds, and maybe there was a communication between that 30-second mark. That's why you have these decimal points. So away from Silk and kind of command line stuff that may or may not look ugly to you, may look great. We'll go to something that's a little better learning curve, especially for junior analysts and whatnot. Any questions on Silk first that I can maybe answer? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Do you know how expandable Silk is? And I take all these different flows, but I've got like, most of it looks like IPFix, but it's the next thing that will change.
It'll be a different sensor per flow type, but you could have RW flow pack running, and I think it's silk.com or sensors.com. It's one of them, and basically you'll just change that sensor setup because you basically just have a bunch of sensors set up and these tab delimited configuration files, and you'll have like an IPFix sensor or a NetFlow version 5 sensor. It has to know what to expect. Yeah, it would be nice if it could just kind of see what it is and be like, oh, I understand. Let me just say the sensor is that. But you're defining IP blocks and stuff like that, so it's not as easy as that. But if you just copy basically what it has and just change it around, again, the documentation is pretty good. So FlowBat is a front end for Silk. It is the flow basic analysis tool. Everyone wants to put like an animal or some kind in a logo, so pick the bat. It could have been a baseball bat, but it's not. You can go there to get FlowBat, or you could just use our script to install it, which will not give you any malware. Trust yes, trust the script. Yeah, there you go. Right. You already have Silk set up, you're fine. You can at least use Silk to see what's going on. To get started with FlowBat, first make sure that your Silk setup works. If your Silk setup doesn't work, you're going to email me and you're like, hey, FlowBat doesn't work, man. And I'm going to say, well, does RW filter and RW cut give you anything? And if you're like, I didn't install that yet, well, that's why it doesn't work, because there's no solution behind it. It sits on top of Silk, and it's the only way it can work. Did you actually run the FlowBat install scripts? If you set it up on your own, then you're probably pretty good with Meteor. If you did not, you probably installed it with the install script. And have you actually tried going to the right place to get to it? That's pretty important. A lot of people do not for some reason. And so basically, you can do a lot of different things. I don't tell people only use FlowBat because there's a lot of scripting you can do with Silk that then is actually really helpful in FlowBat. So you can generate lists, for instance. You could go to like any kind of like OSINT, your favorite OSINT threat page or whatever that has lists of IPs and whatnot. And you could like automatically pull that down and tell Silk, make a list of all this stuff. And then maybe FlowBat is making a dashboard based on that list. So you can kind of like fluidly make those things kind of work together, even though they're really not telling each other to do anything. They're just one's taking the output of the other. So again, this looks familiar, minus a different thing like go get a drink and FlowBat at the top. But the install is basically the same as that Silk on a Box install. This takes like 7 to 9 minutes. There's a CentOS installer that may or may not be a little different. It also does not work on 7. So we get emails about that and there's a ticket out for that already. Epilepsy warning. Close your eyes. So here I am installing FlowBat. It takes like 7 to 9 minutes. Making a chicken brine. So I like to fry food, but chicken's not usually great It's good. It's not great unless you grind it a little bit. Be a wet brine or a dry brine. But it doesn't take too long. In fact, a brine takes like 4 minutes to do for quite a bit of chicken. Keep a lot of salt in the house for this. But I'll provide this recipe later. This is actually a Chick-fil-A chicken nugget recipe. And it uses a pickle marinade. But right now we're done. I'll show you that later. It's pretty fast. And once you've done that, you can go to using it. So here is kind of just looking through data. So that was pretty quick. You don't have to specify RW filter and stuff like that. You don't have to specify types, which you normally would. Normally Silk requires you have an input argument, partitioning argument, and an output argument. It's like pass equals standard out, or the type equals all. Here I just assume that you want all your data. If you don't want it, you can specify type, and it's going to change it. But right now it says type equals all, and then it handles the output on its own. This is, again, the same query as I mentioned in Silk, where it's all records for the current day. Whereas Silk also, the default is current hour if you don't specify the time and date. So here's looking again at those Chinese IP addresses. At the time of making this, NECC was not a field option. We're using the query builder in this case instead of using the command line with autocomplete and whatnot. So here I'm putting in where any IP is a local address. I'm going to specify in additional options that we're going to have NECC equals CN. There are little help things as well. We took a lot of stuff from the Silk documentation and tried to make it to where you don't have to go to the documentation to see what some of these things do, which put a little help bubble. But again, this is a fair amount of time that I'm looking through. It's almost a week of traffic, but it was pretty quick. Especially, you're considering not just 2 IPs, you're considering a lot of traffic. I'm going to reduce this down to just the 5 tuple, like I had previously. This all happens kind of on the fly. It's not reloading anything. If you want to drag and drop stuff, you can do that. So it's pretty fluid. It's maybe not as fluid as something like Splunk, but it's its own thing. I like to think it's better than a few Sim Solutions flow tools that they have built in. But even those are getting better. Here's running some stats. I mentioned the top 10 source desk pairs. Here we're going to do just a time span for the current day, and pick the top 10, which is already the default. And we're going to do the SIP dip pairs by bytes. So what kind we talked about earlier. What's already done. It's almost immediate for the current day. You saw where, I wish I could pause that, but you can see where it does like the bytes and the records and the number of packets. It also does conversions, where Silk would just tell you the total number of bytes. This tells you, megabytes or gigabytes, so that it doesn't start gunking up the fields. Maybe I should have an option to do bytes, but it doesn't have one right now. So how do you count stuff? We talked about bins, and I didn't really talk about how important they are. But we're going to I'll show you the detail real fast. This is the previous 24 hours of data, just outbound stuff. I mentioned that by default it's type equals all, but in this case we're going to do out and out web and a few different things. And then we're just going to kind of graph that based on bin sizes. I think I did 10-minute bins. If not, it's probably too large. Yeah, so it's kind of that's using probably 30-second bins right there, and so it's very compact in there, so it's not very pretty. So we'll split it up to 10-minute bins, and it should be, so it's a lot more flowing, and if you have spikes, for instance, maybe they won't show up for the small amount of time, but maybe they will. I also save this as some sort of name. It's a saved query now, so I can query that later instead of redoing this again like tomorrow or a week from now or every hour. Then I can just run this again over and over and over if I want to. I can also just throw that in the dashboard. So there's my 24-hour outbound data. I can set that up to where it's only bytes or something like that, I can periodically execute that. Previously, if you didn't notice, it was doing a rolling 24 hours, meaning the dates weren't set. Instead, Flowbat's calculating those dates and says, hey, if every 15 minutes you want to run this, calculate the last 24 hours from the time of execution, and then run on that. That way, every time you have, this should keep rolling over. So those humps should keep moving to the left over time. Non-standard ports. This is using, again, it's going to use this, it's like a plug-in deal with Silk. This kind of shows that we can use these additional options, even if they're not in Flowbat, but they've been put into Silk. We can still use these. It's going to use this plug-in called App Mismatch. It's a thing where when the flows are generated, it tagged on what the application, the app thought it was. So it said, hey, that looks like web traffic based on these headers. But we see that it's on port 1800, which is not typical of web traffic. Maybe it's some other thing. And so this is going to kind of blow up and kind of tell me that, hey, this is not all that accurate. We had one distinct port that was different than port 80 that looked like web traffic. So maybe you should check that out. We had 5 of them that looked like SSL that were not on 443. And that's adding it to a dashboard.
Which part of the infrastructure is doing that protocol analysis?
So YAF went and made the flows original. So maybe your network stuff won't be able to do this, maybe it will. Depends on kind of what it is. But YAF has app labeling, which you can turn off if it's too like hardware strenuous or something like that. You can turn it off. I've never had an issue with it, and it's pretty useful. The only downside is that if you were like, hey, let me see all my web servers, you can't really do that because it's looking at the data and not like statefully who is doing it. And so that requires a bit more effort. You could say, show me all web traffic and then do more filtering, but it would be cool if with one filter you could just say, show me everything that's a web server here, where the, source was some sort of, source or desk was some sort of application 80, but instead it's like the generic conversation. And identifying, this kind of goes into that, identifying servers, any kind of services. It works to say, we only want to look at certain things based on ports. But again, we use this app labeling deal to then run some stats and say, well, what ports are actually being used. Again, this was this 1800 was actually the other non-port 80 HTTP thing that was happening. You had 902, which is probably not vSphere stuff, that was a port 443 HTTPS traffic. And so YAF still saw that stuff. But I will say YAF's not perfect on its app labeling either. So you can't always trust it's going to catch everything. But it usually doesn't like accidentally mess up and say, well, port 80 is not port 80. It doesn't ever say that. Analyzing PCAP files. This is not a different tool. This is just night mode. Night mode's a little button in the top right if you're an analyst at night or something doing analysis. You can just kind of throw the PCAP in there as long as it's on the security server. Like let's say you have a PCAP repo on a security ending box or whatever, right? You could just specify any PCAP in any PCAP folder there and just throw it here and it's done. Like basically it's already converting the PCAP and then it's doing the filtering afterwards. Even though you don't see pipes or anything, that's kind of what it's doing. So you could throw additional filters onto it and it'll filter down even more. That's exploit kit traffic right there. Flow automation. We'll kind of go through this pretty quick. So you can do some flow automation. I mentioned this like making the sets and whatnot. There are different tools like called the analysis pipeline. It's made by the same people that make Silk. It uses Silk as well. And essentially through that, it'll do things like beaconing detection. You can have it do like a form of alerting, send stuff to a SIM solution, whatnot. We don't yet interact with Flowbat yet, but that's coming down the road. And then there's Flow Plotter, which is a Silk tool, or at least it integrates with Silk. Basically, you just pipe stuff to it, and it generates some graphs. And either you can make your own dashboards or whatnot. It'll do a little more graphing than Flowbat will. It's all just Bash stuff and some HTML stuff. but for the most part, it's pretty easy to use. Some examples here. Down at the bottom right, you have a force-directed graph that doesn't do anything except bounce around and impress managers and convince people you're right. Next to that, the left of that is a timeline of things happening over time. Maybe how many bytes over time. It kind of uses RW count. In the middle, you have this automated tool that identifies servers on your network of various kinds. You just plop all your data and send it to FlowPlotter and tell it, I want assets, and it's going to say, oh, well, let me take a second. I'm going to check out what all assets you have running. And that can be useful for pretty nefarious purposes too, if you can get a good capture from somebody else's network. There's all kinds of other different graphs. Basically, everything at the top you see is kind of the same stuff, be it pie charts or bar charts or whatever. But for the most part, showing the same things. Summary, still really fast. Not to say log solutions aren't fast too, but it's really, really fast. It has a ton of analysis tools, has great documentation. Flowbat, it's the graphical front end of that. You can do anything that you kind of want with it. As far as junior analysts can really, really easily use it. And I think senior analysts will really appreciate a lot of the autocomplete and whatnot, so you don't have to know what things are as long as you have a vague idea of what this option started with. And you don't even need the query builder at that time. You can just autocomplete everything you want. To put it in perspective, I'm really good with Silk, but I'm better with Flowbat. And it's not because I know it more, it's because I know Silk so well that now it's just so fast to put out queries, it's really painless. Again, it's 5 analysts and 4 analysts. Chris Sanders and I built Flowbat. Maybe it's vulnerable, maybe it's not. Maybe it'd be a good exercise for those guys over there right now. But I don't think it's too vulnerable. It uses a modern version of Meteor and stuff like that. And Meteor's a pretty popular web framework now. You can do this on the Silkbox only, or you can have it interact with a sensor elsewhere via some SSH keys to SCP the data over. And again, it's a kind of a question you ask about the generation. Well, this may be about like the retrieval, where instead of YAF sending it somewhere, maybe it just sets it there, and then this box goes out and grabs it via some sort of method that's a lot safer. Conclusion, flows aren't used very much, even though in this room they're used by over half, which is awesome. They're easy to collect, and there are minimal barriers to entry now, whereas used to it was pretty tough. Here's the chicken recipe, which is really good. It's moderately easy to make. The pickle brine is the king here. And thanks, I appreciate it. I'll keep you longer.